Hello, everyone, and welcome to this podcast introduction to this week's episode of Listening to America. I'm in Bar Harbor, Maine. I'm now in week 3, just beginning week 3 of the great John Steinbeck Travels with Charley tour. Steinbeck said at the beginning of Travels with Charley, "We do not take a trip takes us." That certainly is the case, so I've been out for 14 full days, but the first 9 at least were to get to the starting point at Sag Harbor. I got to Sag Harbor and touched base there and had a wonderful tour of the grounds and his writing shack, Joyous Guard, and it was amazing, thanks to Catherine of Canio's bookstore in Sag Harbor. Then, to do this right, you have to take the ferry 3 times, which I did, from Sag Harbor, bounce, and then a long bounce across Long Island Sound to New London, Connecticut. I did that with the rig. It was a little apprehensive, I will say. And then went to Kerouac's grave, which was not on Steinbeck's trip. And I went to Walden Pond, which was not on Steinbeck's trip. I'm going to do things that Steinbeck didn't do because I'm fascinated and I'm on this journey. And it's somehow, although it's focused on Steinbeck, for whom I have the greatest respect, it's bigger than that. I mean, this is a chance for me to really see amazing places in America, and so I intend to do it. Anyway, I had a great time at Walden, just spiritual, just amazing. And Kerouac's grave, I love On the Road. It's a book I've read, and there are a handful of books I read every couple of years at least. Gulliver's Travels is one of them. Huckleberry Finn is one of them. Dickens' Great Expectations is one of them. Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility is one of them. Dickens' Pickwick Papers is one of them. Hamlet is one of them. The Iliad is one of them. There are more, I suppose, but those come to mind. But I read Walden at least once a year and sometimes more. And there was something in the Middle Ages called Virgilian sortes. What it meant was this, that you could take a copy of Virgil's Aeneid. He wrote the great epic of Rome. You could take a copy of Virgil's Aeneid and open it at random and put your finger at random on a passage, and it would speak to you, that you would then read it, think about it, meditate about it, absorb it, and interpret it. And that your interpretation may vary from time to time and veer from what the poet Virgil intended, but that's not necessarily the point. The point is that certain books are so filled with extraordinary insights and provocative and challenging questions that whenever you turn to them, at any point in your life, in any mood, they're going to speak to you. And I think that's certainly true for me of Thoreau's Walden. I think Walden is America's greatest book. Certainly one of the top 10, and I think really for me top 1. Not everyone agrees, of course. This is the second of my conversations with Russ Eagle, one of my dearest friends, lives in Salisbury, North Carolina. He's a Steinbeck guy. He's writing a book on Steinbeck's Cannery Row. He knows Steinbeck's life, biography, the facts of Steinbeck's world, the sequencing of his work, details that no one else probably knows. Russ is amazing in this regard. And he agreed to host some Steinbeck Travels with Charley tours of me from the Airstream. My friends, I'm having the time of my life. I can't tell you just how perfectly grateful I am. Yesterday I got to see Thoreau's flute. I got to see the green desk he wrote on. He wrote his journal on, wrote Walden on, wrote On the Duty of Civil Disobedience on. I got to see his chair. I mean, it's just amazing. And today I've written about Steinbeck and William L. Shirer, who wrote The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. There's a connection that appears in Travels with Charley. Turns out they were friends, which I didn't really know until now. So I'm making discoveries all along the way. I'm also meeting Americans and others, but mostly Americans, and the casual conversations have been interesting. And in no case have I avoided asking some version of, so, how do you think we're doing as we get close to the 250th birthday of the United States? And people are apprehensive, I can tell you that. But they're not gloomy, but they are exceedingly weary of the situation. An elderly president, a incredibly problematic former president, both of them old men, replaying a very old and tired script, which we've been seeing since 2015 at least. Most of the country not happy with that choice. Now things deeply complicated by the protests on our college campuses regarding what's happening on the Gaza Strip. So when you add up all the inflation and the Trump trial over Stormy Daniels. When you add up all the things that are really edgy, the Ukrainian war, just the nightmare, the ongoing nightmare of the Trump years, like him or not, the whole business is just so wearying. We're exhausted. We're spiritually exhausted. We're politically exhausted. We want a new narrative. We want to change the channel. Anyway, follow along at ltamerica.org and at our Facebook Listening to America site and at my own Clay Jenkinson Facebook site. I'm posting several times a day. I've been doing original drawings, which are being encouraged. And my friend Nate of Salida, Colorado, has made about a dozen drawings of Steinbeck's trip, and they're marvelous. And you'll see the first of them up on the Facebook sites and at ltamerica.org. And we'd love for to form a Steinbeck book club. We'll read 4 books, maybe even 5 before phase 1 is over. Then there'll be a few weeks when I'm home, and then we'll read, at some point we'll be reading Of Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath. So those are bigger books. And then there'll be a couple of smaller pieces, but including Russ's very favorite work of literature, Cannery Row. And then we'll have to go on to wrestle with the big one, East of Eden. But our plan is to read through the works of John Steinbeck. I've always wanted to do that, and this seems like a perfect time to do it. And I'm learning a lot about Steinbeck by learning a lot about Steinbeck and traveling in his wake and thinking about him now every single day and writing about him every single day and talking with someone who really knows what he's talking about, per this, my friend Russ Eagle. So let's go to the program. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I'm your guest host, Russ Eagle, and as regular listeners to this podcast know, Clay is now on the road pulling the Listening to America Airstream. So this is the second time checked in with him, and I'm going to try to track him down here in a second, see where he is, what he's up to, what he's been doing. I'm here in North Carolina, and I'm clicking the link right now. I have no idea where Clay is, but I see him coming up on my screen. Clay, can you hear me?
Is that you, Russ?
That's me.
Well, I greet you. I'm right on the edge of Acadia National Park at Bar Harbor in Maine.
All right, so you made it to Maine.
I made it to Maine.
We haven't talked since you were in Iowa, actually. I've followed you on social media, and I know a few things you have done, but how did you get from eastern Iowa to Maine?
So we last talked when I had left Bismarck on the 27th of April. I went to Minnesota and then Iowa and then Illinois and then Kentucky and Ohio and Pennsylvania and West Virginia and finally New Jersey and New York. And so we last talked when I was in Iowa. Then I went to Illinois along the Illinois River. But the more important next day was at Big Bone Lick, Kentucky, which is a state historic site. It's where Jefferson convinced Meriwether Lewis and William Clark and George Rogers Clark separately at different times to dig for mastodon and mammoth bones for him. It's one of the great mastodon and mammoth sites in North America. And they all did this and sent the fossils to Jefferson at Monticello. So I spent a day there. Then I went on to Pennsylvania, and I had been sort of calculating when to go through the city of New York. You recall, Russ, that Steinbeck was not a big city traffic guy. He didn't like driving in big cities.
Not at all. In fact, he skipped New York the first time and got in trouble when he returned.
Got lost returning, so he says. Anyway, I believe it. Anyway, so then I was in central Pennsylvania, and I thought, I'm due at the house at Sag Harbor. It's very complex to get an appointment at Sag Harbor, but worth it, believe me. And I had to be there at 10:30 the next day, and I thought, there's no way I can get up in Pennsylvania and get across New York City to the end of Long Island. So I decided to barrel through a day preliminary and changed my campsite plans, and then I crossed with Rocinante, with the 23-foot Airstream, the George Washington Bridge at the middle of the day. And I can tell you this, at times I would not have sworn there were more than a few inches between me and the giant trucks on both sides. I felt certain that the trip, I was going to be squeezed to death before I even got started. I'm not scared sorry. I'm not afraid to drive in cities. I lived in Los Angeles. I lived in Denver. I lived in Oxford and London. But this was a little harrowing because there was no margin for error. And of course, these are New York and New Jersey drivers. They're not the gentle drivers of my home state, North Dakota. So nothing bad happened. I got through it. I was thrown off the bridge and into upper Manhattan and soon dumped onto the Long Island Freeway. And after that, it settled down and I got out to the end of Long Island where Sag Harbor is without incident.
Steinbeck had trouble with that sort of traffic in 1960 Minneapolis. So I can only imagine 2024 New York City.
Remember, he says in Travels with Charley that he wanted to see Minneapolis and he particularly wanted to see Golden Prairie, because he liked the name Golden Prairie. Believe me, I've been there. There's nothing particularly beautiful about it. But he wanted to see it, and he got all flummoxed in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and he said, I never saw the city at all.
So you got to Sag Harbor now. There are really two homes. Steinbeck lived in a number of places, but the two homes that seemed most special to him were the 11th Street Cottage in Pacific Grove, which we'll probably talk about later in the year when we get to the Monterey novels. But and then this, he called it a fishing house at Sag Harbor. So what did you think of it?
I can't wait for you to see it. It's no longer a fishing house. It's been purchased by the University of Texas. It's been purchased by the University of Texas at Austin. Same people that take care of the archives where you were doing some Steinbeck research about a month ago. Right. And they paid about $14 million for it, so it's no longer a fishing shack. It's been heavily refurbished inside, new kitchen, and they've changed a number of things. They've tried to keep it Steinbeckian, but they've added some flourishes. The grounds are magnificent. A lovely bookstore owner who was part of the project to get it purchased in this way, Catherine, was our guide. I was with my videographer Nolan. He's since gone back to North Dakota. It's a wonderful, wonderful house. The house is a little smaller than I had thought, but the grounds are way bigger than I had thought. But for me, the real goal was to see what's called Joyous Guard, which is his little writing hut that he had built right on the Sound, right on the bay. Was it hexagonal or?
Yes.
Yes. So, and he called it Joyous Guard because he was heavily into this project on King Arthur and his knights. He was trying to translate a book from Middle English into modern English. And so everything was Arthurian during this period. And so he called his boat the Fairy Lane, which is a riff on the Morte d'Arthur, this medieval book. And he called his writing shack Joyous Guard, which was the castle that Lancelot in Arthur takes Guinevere to finally after everything shatters and they've broken up the round table, and he takes her to his home castle, which was known as Joyous Guard. So that thrilled me, and I think it would have thrilled you because you really got a sense of him. As you know, he built it so small that visitors would not really find any comfort in it. And Catherine, our guide, said that, as you probably know, Russ, that he didn't have it. He didn't have it wired for electricity. So when he needed light, he would string electrical cords, long electrical cords, all the way out from the house. It's 30 yards away, so that's a lot of electrical cords. But it was great.
Yeah, I think his thinking was he wasn't going to put in phone lines, but he also wasn't going to put in electricity because that would lead to an intercom. Yeah, he wanted total isolation out there.
So it's really, I mean, you love to go to these places. I love to go to these places, the graves of writers and historical figures that I greatly admire, or the houses where certain things were done. But seeing Joyous Guard, this hexagonal writing shack, where he wrote The Winter of Our Discontent, what else would he have written there?
Charley.
Parts of it in the Caribbean, as you know, but parts there.
Yeah, America and Americans.
Which is a kind of a companion set of essays to Travels with Charley. So, he did a lot of writing. They have a little stack of pencils. I got one for you. That was absolutely great. So then, I've touched base at Sag Harbor. That's really all I wanted to do.
Well, I won't hear about the ferry ride once you left Sag Harbor.
So, Russ, As you know, Steinbeck did not want to fight the traffic in New York City. And I'm sure it was much worse then because the great freeways hadn't been built yet. It's still a nightmare, but back then it must have been especially congested. So he decided to take the ferry. And so I thought, okay. So there are 3 ferries. The first one takes you from Sag Harbor to Shelter Island. The second one farther along. They're both short ferry rides. And then the big one is from Point Orient all the way across the Long Island Sound to New London, Connecticut. So I made sure that they could take a 23-foot RV and figured out the cost of that and made a reservation. So I have to say, Russ, I had some apprehension about this. I just had a kind of nightmare that something could terribly go wrong here. But the first day, somehow I forget to put the parking brake on and the Airstream goes to the bottom of the Sound. I thought maybe of going around again all the way out through New York City and then up to Connecticut. But in the end, I wanted to be true to Steinbeck, and so I did those 3 ferries, and the weather was perfect, and it was actually wonderful. It was a wonderful way to really get into the Steinbeck mode, because now you're really doing it in Steinbeck's fashion.
All right, so from Sag Harbor, you next hit the land in where? New London?
New London, Connecticut. Remember, and he writes about it in Travels with Charley because he sees a submarine. It's one of our big submarine bases then and now. And you have made the case a number of times in our conversations that his period of reporting World War II, both in North Africa and in Europe, scarred him and maybe gave him a kind of a PTSD. I think that some of the best evidence is in Travels with Charley when he says when he saw those submarines, he had kind of a visceral revulsion because he remembered ships of soldiers and just innocent people going down in the Atlantic and worrying when he crossed the Atlantic that a German submarine might torpedo those boats. So it kind of did a PTSD flashback for him. And he hated the Cold War anyway, as you know. He even talks about it a little bit in his Nobel Prize speech.
Right. In Travels with Charley, he describes the bodies of soldiers pulled from the oil slicks where ships had taken down. So yes, that had a huge effect on him.
So I think that's part of this. And I talked with lots of people on the ferry, and I said, "Is it always this calm?" And they said, "Oh, no. You have no idea how wild this ferry ride can get." Then we went over something called Plum Gut, and a woman who'd been kind of listening to me talk said, Are you trying to talk about Plum Gut? And I said, "No, what's that?" And she said, "Well, that's kind of the Bermuda Triangle of Long Island Sound. Lots of boats have gone down there." So now I'm shaking. It was really extraordinary. But it got across. New London is beautiful. And so now I have started. I've cut off 4.5 hours by skirting New York City, and I am in Connecticut and Massachusetts. And my goal for that night, Russ, was to deviate a little from our man Steinbeck, because I wanted to go to Lowell, Massachusetts, up at the top of Massachusetts, for the purpose of visiting the grave of one of my other heroes, Jack Kerouac. And that was truly a wonderful and moving experience.
I'd like to hear more about that, but we need to take a short break right now. This is Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Listening to America. We're talking with Clay, who is now in Maine. Clay, you mentioned Kerouac's grave, and I did see a post you made on social media, so I do want to remind listeners that while they can hear a lot about your trip here, you're posting daily, I think, and sometimes multiple times per day, so by all means, they should check daily with that. Kerouac, another hero of yours, you were saying.
Jack Kerouac is one of my heroes. He wrote On the Road. It was published in 1957. He wrote a whole series of other books. But that's the one that made him famous, and that's still the most famous of all the books that he wrote. It's a young man's travel book. He hitchhiked and he rode the bus, and he slept in bus stations and city parks, and it's the kind of thing that you have a great dream romance with when you're 17 or something. But as you grow older, your appetite for hitchhiking without penniless across the country and wondering where you're going to get a meal, or whether the people who picked you up are going to do something unspeakable. The word beat, from which we get beatnik, but the word beat really coined by Kerouac, and it means down and out. It means ragged, hungry, a little frightened, toes sticking out of the front of your shoes. So to be beat was really to enter a period of severe voluntary poverty and see if you could use your wits to cross the nation. Of course, then there's the search for the American dream, and also the search for women, who play a huge role in it. The book is really a book about Neal Cassady, the famous Neal Cassady, who in the book is called Dean Moriarty. But anyway, I've taught it many times. I've loved it. It's one of my favorite books. I admit that it speaks more to, I think, a young man than to a senior citizen. But I've always wanted to go to his grave, Russ, and I taught him this last year and did a lot of work on him. And so I knew that it was in Lowell. I found it, and it's like Steinbeck's grave. You and I have been there a couple of times in Salinas. It has pencils that people leave, and lighters, and cigarettes, and badges, and little notes, and so on. There are some literary pilgrims that go there, and so I don't think Steinbeck really knew the work of Kerouac. Do you have any sense of that?
I don't know that I think Steinbeck would have admired him.
I'm not sure he would have liked him, right?
Right.
I think he would have said, "Oh, get a life," or, I think he would have found it self-indulgent, and I think he would have been a little, he was a pretty open-minded man about lots of things, but I'm wondering if he would have admired the kind of precipitate prose with no punctuation and just writing on a continual scroll, and just sort of, what Truman Capote said of it, that Kerouac claimed, and I think it's true, that he wrote it on one long sheet of paper, and then he rolled it up in the end and took it to a publisher, and that he had written it like in a 30-hour high on bennies, on some sort of uppers. Most of that is true. But when Truman Capote heard that he had written Stream of Consciousnness without punctuation on the continuous roll, Capote said, "That's not writing, that's typing." But I love Kerouac, and so I was glad to go, and it was surprisingly moving. It's just like Steinbeck's grave in Salinas. It's from a grave point of view, they're kind of disappointing, but from you are there, a pilgrimage to a great person's resting place, it's fabulous.
Steinbeck essentially chose his grave, or to be part of the family cemetery. The Hamilton family from East of Eden. There's one tombstone there that pretty much reads like, the cast of the book or the cast of the movie. But he also wanted to have that view of Fremont Peak from his grave.
It wouldn't have surprised me if he had been cremated and his ashes scattered in the Pacific Ocean. It wouldn't have surprised me if he had been scattered up on Fremont Peak. His being buried in the family plot in a cemetery in Salinas tells you, in the end, how deeply committed he was to his genealogy and to his family.
And interesting, Kerouac, I think late in life, retreated out to Steinbeck country and spent time in Big Sur.
Tried to dry out in Big Sur. Lawrence Ferlinghetti, another one of my heroes. If you've never read his book, The Coney Island of the Mind, great book of Ferlinghetti's poetry, very accessible poetry. Ferlinghetti also owned City Lights Books in San Francisco. I go there every time I'm in San Francisco. It's still an amazing place. And he had a cabin out at Big Sur. You've been on that road where that incredibly elegant bridge crosses a chasm right there. Amazing bridge.
Bixby Creek Bridge.
Right. And right up that creek was Ferlinghetti's cabin. So by now, poor Kerouac was a very serious drunk, an alcoholic, and beginning to make a fool out of himself often. And out of creative juices. And so he decided to try to dry out by going to Ferlinghetti's cabin. And he lasted about 8 days, and then he hitchhiked into San Francisco and did a lot of binge drinking with his pals.
Speaking of your heroes, I noticed that you also made it to Walden Pond.
Russ, I've been to Walden many times, but I wanted to go again. You get so close. This is going to be a problem. I mean, I think you can sense this. Like, I have so many different interests. I got to remember the Steinbeck. That's my focus here. But I was so close to Walden, I thought, I have to go there. I did, and it was really, really beautiful. And I walked into the interpretive center, and the guy at the desk said, "How you doing?" And I said, "Great, a beautiful day." And he said, "I think you're that guy." And he recognized my voice from Ken Burns films, and so it was great. He was couldn't have been more accommodating. He made some special things happen and talked about his own interest in reading the journals of Henry David Thoreau. But as you know, I love Thoreau, and I regard Walden as America's greatest book. So I went there and wrote about it. It's on Facebook. And then I've written 4 or 5 dispatches for the website, ltamerica.org. I've been working, and it's not even a burden every day. I just before we began talking, this is the 11th. And by the way, it's dusk here in this KOA campground in Bar Harbor. There are dogs here tonight and families. Tomorrow's Mother's Day. And the northern lights may or may not appear here. They were worried about clouds, but it's actually now cloudless to the north. And so maybe I'm in for a spectacular display of the aurora. And I'm 41 miles from Deer Island, and Steinbeck did go to Deer Island. I chose not to because he went there sort of as a favor to, as you know, to his agent Elizabeth Otis. And it didn't seem to me that it was central to my mission, but I'm close. So anyway, Thoreau's Walden was fantastic. I went to see Emerson's house. The museum in Concord actually has Thoreau's desk and his flute. So that was another great literary pilgrimage. But now I'm back in Steinbeck country, and I'll stay another day because I want to see Acadia National Park, which, he's surprisingly quiet on the national parks. He has that one bad experience in Yellowstone when Charley went nuts over the bears. But that wasn't his focus, and Steinbeck's focus wasn't going to literary graves or sites. He was really traveling the roads of America and trying to figure out in roadside culture the mood of America in 1960. And of course, there's a debate about how successful all of that was. But I could see that it would be very easy to lose focus because there are literally scores of places I would like to see in Maine and New Hampshire alone. And at some point, I've got to get on the road west.
Well, just there in Concord and Lexington, I mean, every time you go around a corner, there's the Alcott house or there's the Emerson house. It's just one thing after another.
Yeah, and I did not know about the Concord Museum, but when I was at Walden Pond Interpretive Center, this man Kyle said, "Oh, you need to go there. They've got his furniture." So I didn't know that. It was it's first rate, the museum anyway, but his furniture is very, very moving, including an Aeolian harp, which is a stringed instrument that the wind plays automatically. And the Romantics loved this because it sort of said that nature is in itself creative and musical. Anyway, that was spectacular. I went to North Bridge and watched some school children being told about the shot heard round the world on April 19th, 1775. Yeah, as you say, Concord is limitless in all the culture that it offers. Steinbeck, again, does not seem particularly interested in the transcendentalists. He doesn't mention Thoreau much, twice, I think, in his letters, in both ways, not very substantively. And I don't know of references to Emerson. Maybe you do, but I don't know references to Alcott, although I'm sure he admired Little Women.
Grapes of Wrath was always described as Emersonian. Preacher Casey's lines about, one big soul and that sort of thing.
Talked to my daughter who's in Oxford today by FaceTime, and I was telling her about Concord, and she said, "Well, I hope you went to Louisa May Alcott's house." And I said, "Well, no." So she browbeat me for a while and said, "How about Emily Dickinson? How about Margaret Fuller?" But again, the temptation is just to keep diverting from the mission.
Right, and I can see you ending up sort of like Chevy Chase in Vacation. You get somewhere and you've got 30 seconds to look at it, and then you've got to hit the road.
And when he says to his kids, "Quick, back in the car, it's only 400 miles to the world's largest ball of twine."
One thing that I saw on one of your posts, your visit to Walden Pond, was a drawing. In fact, there have been several pieces of artwork. This is one of your talents I was not aware of.
I think the word talent is perhaps a misnomer, but I've never been a drawer. But I thought how do you learn how to draw? I mean, if you're not a natural, how do you learn how to draw? Well, you learn how to draw by drawing. And I thought it would be fun to draw some of the scenes that I've been seeing. They're sort of like a cross between drawings and political cartoons because I add text and commentary and so on. And so I've done one on that I haven't yet shared with you on Theodore Roosevelt's home, Sagamore Hill on Long Island, and I've done one on Thoreau, the most complicated of them. I've done one on Kerouac, and I've done several others, and I don't know if these are any use to the people that come to the Facebook sites or to ltamerica.org, but I'm having a lot of fun with it. And however primitive these are, they matter in some sense because they're another kind of journaling for the experiences that I'm having. And maybe I will gain some very, very, very limited capacity to draw.
Well, I'm calling it Clay Sketchbook.
Yeah, exactly.
And I do see a book at the end of the trip, so I do think you need to keep these up.
Oh yes, and I've got them all in a special tablet, like a drawing tablet. And first I only had, when I started, I bought these in, I think, Fergus Falls, Minnesota, and I thought I probably shouldn't spend more than about $5 on the colored pencils because I'm sure to quit after 3 days. Then yesterday I was at a Target somewhere in New Hampshire and I bought the 120 pencil version. So now I've got the whole panoply of colors and I'm into it. So people can go to the LT America, Listening to America Facebook site, or just as easily go to the website, ltamerica.org, and they'll see a lot of things beginning to accumulate here. And I've had tremendous response on Facebook. It's just amazing, more than I could have anticipated, and people are sharing it. And I'm thinking that this could really maybe have some appeal beyond, the little world that I live in.
And these drawings may lead to a gallery show when you...
I should hope so. Do you draw at all?
No. I would love to be able to draw.
Have you ever tried?
Yes.
Well, I'm sure I am terrible at it and will not get much better. But I remember reading a Woody Allen comic essay once, and it was called Flo. And Flo was like this mafia dame who was married to the worst mafia criminal in New York. And so Flo decided that she wanted to be a concert violinist until she realized that would require something called practice. That's how, if you practice, you're going to get less bad at almost anything.
You were recognized, you said that was at Walden.
Yes, Kyle recognized me but most people that I've talked to, including some people who, are in the Steinbeck world, have said they've never heard of me. So that's always putting you back in a real perspective about the ripple effect you've had on the universe.
Have you been recognized on the road yet?
No, I'm almost, and I've shaved my head. I look like a convict. I'm out of context. I think would almost never be recognized. But if I open my mouth, that's where I tend to get recognized. But I don't just wander into a Starbucks and start saying we hold these truths to be self-evident or by Godfrey. But this is fun. I don't. As you know, I'm really shy about putting myself forward amongst strangers and saying, I don't know if you know who I am, but I have written a book. I'm very introverted and shy about that. But if I say, like he just says, hey, welcome. And I said, it's a great day. And he said, I've heard that voice.
And you are up there in the world of Ken Burns in that general area, so...
I was just interviewed for my 7th film back in Bismarck the day before I left on Thoreau, and so I went to Walden, and the interview in Bismarck was great fun. So when I went to Walden, I had a little video made of me saying, "Here I am at the mothership." I quoted a piece from Thoreau, and I said, "I'm begging for a second interview," and I sent it off to the Ken Burns people. So I think there'll be an injunction against me here shortly.
And have you slept every night in the camper?
Yes, sir, I have. I haven't told you yet about the trap that Bill Steigerwald tried to get me into. So as you know, Bill Steigerwald is the bad boy of Steinbeck studies. He wrote this investigative journalism proving that Steinbeck made some stuff up and embellished some stuff and slept in hotels more often than he wants to admit and was with his wife more often than he wants us to know, and that the dialogue is probably largely embellished or invented, etc. As you've said before, there's nothing particularly new in all of that, but he published a book called Dogging Steinbeck in 2012. He and I have crossed swords a little bit over the years, but we're kind of friends. And so I wrote to him a few months ago and said, if I come, will you be interviewed by me? And he said, sure. So he came to this. I was in this horrible campground in Bethany, West Virginia, next to a coal-fired power plant, and the little RV park, which really wasn't an RV park that I was in, looked like it was a meth lab. But I didn't want to come into town because it would be so inconvenient. I wanted to interview Steigerwald in the rig, like as Steinbeck would. And so he came out, and we had a 2.5 hour interview. And he was great, by the way, funny. I gave him 4 or 5 opportunities to say that he wishes he had been nicer in his book, but he refused on principle. But he turns out to be a pretty good guy. And he's much less doctrinaire, much less angry, much less sneery in person than he was when he published the book. I don't know what that spirit was all about. He didn't really like Steinbeck, and he didn't like Steinbeck's politics, and he didn't like Trials of Charley, and he realized that Steinbeck was, just shaping the journey a little bit for the book, and he finds that unforgivable. But we had a good time with that, and so he's the first of the interviews I'll be doing with noted Steinbeck scholars. And
you should have taken him along with you to Walden Pond and pointed out that Thoreau took some liberties with his narrative as well.
I truly don't think that Bill Steigerwald understands that Steinbeck wasn't attempting to write a reporter's hour-by-hour, day-by-day, location-by-location notebook about his travels, that he had always intended to write a book, a piece of literature. And I think that Bill is an investigative reporter with good credentials. He's done really important work for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and the Pittsburgh Tribune, among others. He was in L.A., too. When he tells you about his career, it's pretty amazing. And he took this on because it was the 50th anniversary of Steinbeck's trip. This was 2010. And I don't think he really thought about it until he got out there. And then he realized, oh, my goodness, it doesn't all track. And he hasn't ever been able to think, well, that's sort of what you would expect from a famous national writer and novelist. At no point, as you know, Russ, at no point in the book does Steinbeck pretend that this is precisely what happened.
Are you sticking to the blue highways?
That's an interesting question. Yes and no. I mean, even the blue highways are so much better now. They're often 4-lane, and you wind up on some freeways, and I'm okay with that. Sometimes you just have to get somewhere. In other words, I'm not being an absolute literalist to go on only the numbered roads that Steinbeck was on, and I don't have William Least-Heat Moon's disenchantment with the idea that you would ever be on a freeway for any purpose. But now that I'm out of New York and away from Boston, the roads get more local, less there are fewer interstate highways, or there are ways around the interstate highways.
All right, Clay, we need to take a break. When we come back, maybe you can give us some idea of where you're headed, and also maybe we can talk about our Steinbeck book club.
Yes.
This is Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. Clay is in Maine, and Clay, you say you're going to maybe spend a day there before you hit the road?
I've never been to the national parks, the eastern side of the United States, except Great Smoky Mountains, and that was back when I was at university in Vanderbilt in Nashville. So I don't think I can go by Acadia. I'm only about 12 miles from it, so I'll go through that in the morning. It's Mother's Day. Russ, I'm going to try to find a church. I'm going to try to find a steepled white church, but I'll certainly find a church and go to a service tomorrow, because that's something that Steinbeck wanted to do more of. As far as we know, he only did it once. But I would like to do that, especially on Mother's Day, because I've been thinking about my own mother and the mother of my child. And then I'm going to go to Calais. And as you know, Calais is not at the top of Maine, but it's up. And it's there, as you know, Russ, that Steinbeck had his famous encounter with the Canucks, which was the term he used for French-Canadian people who were sort of across the border and back. This is Canada, and were potato pickers, and he invited them to come visit him at the rig at his camper, and they did, up to 9 of them, he says, and he had cleared everything and tidied up. He said, it's amazing how much work you'll go to for a party, and he had some whiskey for the older people. And
he had cognac.
Yeah, you're right, cognac, and it was a special bottle of cognac, and he made them drink it all. It's quite funny about it, actually. And again, people like Steigerwald say, well, did that even happen at all? And here's my view, and I'm going to send this to you. I wrote about this today, but my view is that everything happened. Maybe not exactly as it seems in the book, but I don't believe there's a single incident in Travels of Charley that didn't in some sense occur in some way on that 11,500-mile journey. I do not agree with those who say, well, some story from earlier in his life, and there was a lull in the action, so he kind of incorporated it here, or others that say he made up whole incidents. I don't think that's true at all. I think, and I'm really certain that there was a Canuck encounter. Why would you make that up? And so when I was talking to Steigerwald, who's the number one skeptic, but not alone, I said to him, why would he make up that story? What does he gain by making up that story? And he had no real answer for that. And then later in the famous story about the itinerant actor in North Dakota, I said, why? How could you make that story up? There's so much detail, and it's so improbable. It's the last place you'd expect to meet someone like this. Why would he be making this up? And what does he gain if he made it up? What does he gain for this book by talking about an encounter with a failed elocutionist, an actor? Steigerwald at that point said, well, North Dakota is boring. Maybe he just needed some story for his time in North Dakota. But you take my point. So I believe the Canuck incident occurred. I'll be there not tomorrow night, but the night following. I don't know if I'll encounter...
Steinbeck was there for the potato harvest.
Right, that harvest won't be coming for months. And Maine is no longer a big potato producer. But I want to go there because I think that's a very important... I'm trying to hit all the most important Steinbeck waypoints. And so Deer Island didn't seem to me that it was essential because he went there really as a favor to his agent, Elizabeth Otis. But I think that the Calais Canuck incident is absolutely central. It's where he really establishes his style that, as he gets to a place, he lets the dog out, the dog gets into trouble or starts barking or who knows what, gets in a garbage can. Steinbeck comes out to rescue the dog, apologizes to whoever else is there. They say, oh, what you doing in that rig? And he says, why don't you come by later and I'll give you a cup of coffee. And one or three, or in this case, many, come by and he gives them coffee and they sit around. And then at some point he says, mind if I sweeten that a little? And then he gets out his brandy or his whiskey or whatever. That was his M.O., using the dog as bait. He wanted to have little parties. He wanted to bring people into the camper to talk about America and to see. I mean, people were even more fascinated by these things then because RVs were a brand new thing in 1960. And so I don't have a dog, but I will go to Calais, and I would love to have an encounter with some French Canadians if that were possible.
What is your M.O. for meeting people?
I'm not great at that, because I have no dog, for one thing. So I walk, when I'm at a campground, I walk around at about 5 p.m. with a gin and tonic. If I saw some people with an interesting looking RV or a sign, I'm hers, she's mine, we're the Smiths, that kind of thing, The love you take is equal to the love you make, and the other signs that are everywhere. If I see that, and they're sitting around outside, I'd say, hey, that's an interesting looking rig. And then you almost automatically are invited to have a conversation. I got here tonight to Bar Harbor, checked in, and I wasn't even out of my pickup when behind me someone said, you're from North Dakota? And I turned around and this woman said, yeah, we're from Minnesota. We never see anyone from North Dakota. They travel all the time in their RV and so on. What have I learned? I've learned that people are all too willing to talk. On the ferry, I was sitting with 3 or 4 different people in the course of an hour, and they all talked, had theories, had opinions, had ideas, had stories, of course. I would ask them, timing was right, I'm working on this because it's the 250th birthday of America. How do you see things now? And of course, it's been a tiny sample, but so far everyone has said, I'm just so sick of this. I'm just sick of the whole prolonged public crisis that we're having. I'm just, basically they said a pox on all their houses. And I haven't met a single strong Bidenite, although more people that I've met want him than the other guy. And I haven't met a single strong Trumpite. It's been, people really are weary, I think, and just wishing this nightmare that's been going on since 2010 at least, and really from 2015, they wish this nightmare would end, and they don't really want to talk about politics.
And I think that was maybe part of your motivation for this trip. You suspected that there was more to people than this left-right dichotomy.
It's amazing because so we're going past Gut Punch or Plum Gut, whatever it is, the burying ground. And this woman was talking about it, and then the guy next to her said, that's not true. And he said that it was once like our Wuhan. It was where we did biological and chemical testing, and that Mrs. Clinton had run for the U.S. Senate in New York almost exclusively to get rid of it, and she was able to do it. And then at that point I said, are you saying that the COVID-19 came out of the lab at Wuhan? He said, of course, 1,000%. Everyone knows that. So, I mean, just like people have their views and their opinions and their stories and certainly strong feelings about a lot of different things. But I think their strongest feeling is we American people are not being served well by our political system, and especially by the two elderly men who are the standard bearers for the Republican and the Democratic Party, and that this nightmare is not over yet because one of them is going to be president. There's a very good chance that the next vice president, one of the two vice presidents, whoever they are, will become the next president of the United States or become a president during the next 8 years. So I think everyone realizes this needs to end, and it's just not going to end. It's just we're going to be living through this for 4 or 5 more years at least.
Yeah, Steinbeck, I know you're in the early stages of your trip, but he found, he was on the road in the weeks and months headed into the election of 1960, but he found it difficult to get an opinion from most people.
So people didn't want to talk about it, he had to push them. I don't think that's true anymore. But I'll tell you what else I've learned, Russ. There's I don't think Steinbeck could have seen this because it came much later, but there's a whole RV world out here now. I met a couple tonight who spent part of the year in Florida, and then they just wander around the country in their Winnebago. They have no home anymore. I met somebody the other day who lives in a modified van that he bought. Everywhere I go, there are really 3 types of RV sites. Within a single campground, people that come for a night or two. Then there are people that are there for months. They just rent space and live there for months. And then there are people that are workers who travel where the work is, and so they might live in a place for 3 months, or they might live in a place for 3 years, but if the oil boom ends or whatever, they can pick up and move to the next place where there's work. And so that's a whole world.
RV people, are similar to what Steinbeck was saying about the mobile home people, sort of like he was on different ends of a trend. He talked about them moving to where there was work and having their own neighborhoods and their own media and so forth. And he was invited into several of them.
Yeah, dinner with a family, a couple. But remember, he thought that people could really move mobile homes.
Right.
That doesn't happen anymore. Now, people leave their mobile homes and move to another mobile home park somewhere. But the promise that people were just going to pick up and move, they're too big, it's too much bother, there's too much stuff in them by the time you want to move. And so it's been the RV that turns out to be the thing he was anticipating.
Steinbeck met a lot of people, too, at breakfast, he said. And you just talked about having dinner with people. How are you feeding yourself on the road? Are you cooking?
Mostly, I am cooking. I had a lovely sandwich tonight, a baguette and a piece of cheese and a piece of salami, and I'm now having a glass of wine. It's now officially dark in Bar Harbor, Maine, and the Northern Lights have not made an appearance yet. Things quiet down pretty quickly in these campgrounds. People come in at about 4. They spend an hour and a half setting out their carpets and their tiki lights and their private flags and their public flags and getting the dogs settled and leveling the rig and hooking up water and hooking up sewer and hooking up electricity and then going to the shop to buy whatever. That takes a long time for some people. I can do it in about 10 minutes because no tiki lamps yet. And then in the morning, they go to bed about 9, sometimes 8. They're probably mostly asleep right now. And then in the morning, if I get up at 8, almost everyone's gone. They've packed up and left. So it's a whole different clock from the clock that I'm used to using. But I found that the people that I'm meeting are really nice. And I met a couple last night in another part of the Northeast, and he was a successful contractor. He decided to retire and see America. He bought an RV. He met the woman he's married to now somewhere in Arizona. They travel the country. Sometimes they park the rig and go to Hawaii for a month. And there's a lot of wealth in America now. People, I think, are, Tocqueville was right when he said the American people are inherently restless. But I think that for a lot of people, the idea of getting out on the road, especially if you can carry, a luxury home with you with 3 television sets and so on, they like the idea of nomadism. And I haven't met anyone who didn't seem happy. As to the larger question of where do you meet people, I've been cooking for myself mostly. For the first 2 weeks I was moving pretty fast, and now I'm trying to slow the pace. And so tomorrow, my plan is to get up, drive a couple of hours, find a roadside diner, go in, order America's greatest meal, 2 eggs, sourdough toast, bacon, orange juice, fried potatoes, or hash browns. That Steinbeck said you can't wreck that one. But I think, I've also noticed, Russ, that if you wanted to, you could travel from Monterey to Long Island without ever doing anything but eat at McDonald's, especially east of the Mississippi. Every 20 minutes there's a McDonald's. Fast food really didn't exist in Steinbeck's time, just the very, very, very beginnings of it, and he's not too happy about it when he sees it. But today, I think you're most likely to get a good morning conversation if you go to a McDonald's or a Burger King or an Arby's or somewhere where the local men come and sit around together. That's where I've had the best conversation. So I stop if I can find a parking spot, I'll stop at a McDonald's at 9 or 10 in the morning and just see if there's a woman's coffee clutch or a men's coffee clutch or a mixed clutch, and then I sit near them, and if they say something that I find I can actually get in without being a jerk, then I might say, hey, I just heard you say there's a submarine base here, tell me more.
One of the most famous or most quoted lines from Travels with Charley, you see it on posters and greeting cards and everywhere, is, "We do not take a trip, it takes us." So to what extent is your trip taking itself?
I have that statement on my little whiteboard. My Airstream came with a little whiteboard, and the first thing I did was to print it out with a dry erasable black marker, because I believe that. We do not take a trip takes us. So you've heard me say, you do not write a book. Eventually the book writes you. It tells you how it's going to end. I found that true. It's a little unusual, let me say, to be in an Airstream, because you have to be much more cautious. You can't just stop on a dime to take pictures. I'm constantly looking in the rear view mirrors and making sure that I'm driving defensively, because there's not a lot of room for error. The whole thing is about 48 feet long with the pickup, and so then you can't just park anywhere. You have to sort of have a strategy. And, you live in fear of entering something where there's no egress, and you're going to have to try to back that thing 100 yards or 30 yards. And so it doesn't lend itself to, spontaneity too much, and you have to sort of plan where you're going to spend the night. I think it'll get easier as I go along, but I'm discovering a lot. And so what's happening to me, the trip is taking me in that I think if I'm this close to Walden Pond, I'm going to Walden Pond. If I'm on a literary pilgrimage, I'm going to see Kerouac's grave. Steinbeck says, he says that one night after he had a conversation with a local farmer, he sat down and he read a little of Schirer's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. It's 1,249 pages. The problem with the story is that Steinbeck writes about this in September of 1960, but the book wasn't published until mid-October of 1960. So today I wrote about this. I'll send it to you. But there are 3 possibilities here, right? One is that he has an advance copy. He knew Shirer. Shirer knew him. They were friends. Steinbeck was well connected in the publishing world. He could easily have had an advance copy. The second possibility is that he bought the book somewhere down the line on the trip, and later when he was trying to recreate it, he mistakenly put it before the actual publication date. And the third possibility is that he's just making it up, but I don't think that's possible. Do you?
No. I mean, it gets back to your earlier statement. What reason does he have to make that up? We've talked about this before, and I don't remember if it was in a podcast or not, but Pat Covici also loved to send Steinbeck books. Certainly there in New York, he had the connections to get hold of a copy. So,
well, at your suggestion, I looked at Benson, so I have a copy of the definitive biography of Steinbeck with me. I wish it were an ebook, as I know you do too. And I looked, and there are a couple references to Shirer. They were friends. I did not know this. They met. They were friends. When Steinbeck went to report the war, they spent time together in London. So that I think there was a relationship there, and I bet there's more to it than we know. And I know you're trying to get a copy of an interview between Jackson Benson and Shirer that's in the Stanford archives. So I'll be eager to see what you find from that. But so it's quite possible that there's more to this story than we know, that they saw each other in New York from time to time, and that, of course, Steinbeck would have been aware of this book. He might have said, can you find a way, Pat, or can you find a way, Shirer, to get me an advance copy? We just don't know. So I'd like to solve that tiny little mystery. It's not of great importance. But that's why I went to Coe College, because Shirer graduated from there in 1925. And so it was a connection. And I went, and unfortunately, even though he's their most famous alum by far, they don't even have a plaque. They don't have a portrait. They don't have a photograph. They don't have a shrine. So I lobbied them to make more of this. I mean, think of what an empowerment story this is for students, that he was poor. He barely was able to go to college. He was the editor of the local newspaper in the college, the Cosmos. The president of Coe read his columns and his editorials, thought he had talent, called him in on the day of his graduation, and the president gave Shirer a $100 bill and said, "This is a loan, now go live your dream." And Shirer took that money and went to Paris and became one of the most important journalists of the 20th century. And he wrote a book that holds up even now, Hitler and the War, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. That's a student empowerment story, and so I'm pushing them to maybe do more with him. And I'm going to try to at least donate a beautiful framed portrait of Shirer that should go somewhere in the library. But that was, you see how much I'm straining this. So I go to Coe College because Steinbeck had a copy of The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. But hey, it's one of the few books he mentions, isn't it?
It is. And speaking of books, we've run out of time. We didn't get to talk about Cup of Gold, but you and I, and hopefully listeners out there, have finished Steinbeck's first book, The Cup of Gold. And we have moved on to A God Unknown, which Steinbeck wrote second but published third. But I think that's the one you should read second, just if you want to see Steinbeck's development.
Just quickly to our listeners, so you and I have agreed to read all of Steinbeck through this year. And so we've begun, and I read Cup of Gold, his first novel, published in 1927. You read Cup of Gold. And I believe you're going to catch up with me maybe in the middle of America a couple of times, so we'll see about that. I'm looking forward to that. Russ, to all of our listeners, I hope you're enjoying this. Follow along, go to your atlas, go to Facebook, and go to ltamerica.org, and you can really see that I'm just really posting a lot, and there's much more to post. Having the time of my life. I'm not weary. I'm ready to roll. I'm not lonely, and I'm kind of loving the...
All right, thanks. We look forward to that, and Clay will be back next week with another edition of Listening to America.